You think Sleeping Beauty is just a fairy tale? Think again. The true origins of these beloved children's stories are far more twisted and terrifying than any bedtime story ever let on. Get ready to discover the shocking, dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of tales you grew up loving. The needle pierced her finger, and Princess Talia collapsed into eternal sleep. But this wasn't the gentle slumber of Disney's imagination. This was something far more sinister tale that would reveal how the most beloved children's stories emerged from humanity's darkest chapters. In 1634, Italian author Giambattista Bosel penned the original version of Sleeping Beauty, titled Sun, Moon, and Talia. What he created wasn't a children's story, it was a tale of horror that would make modern audiences recoil in disgust. But Bosel wasn't inventing these horrors from imagination. He was drawing from real practices and beliefs that plagued medieval Europe. Princess Talia didn't wake to true love's kiss. She woke to find herself a mother. The curse that befell Talia was based on genuine medieval fears surrounding unexplained comas and cataleptic states. In an era before advanced medical knowledge, people who fell into deep, death-like sleeps were often buried alive. The terror of waking up in a coffin was so prevalent that wealthy families began installing bells and breathing tubes in their burial vaults. But for young women, there was an even worse fate than premature burial being discovered in their vulnerable state. While Talia lay unconscious in her cursed sleep, a married king discovered her body in the abandoned castle. Medieval law in many regions didn't recognize rape if the victim was unconscious or mentally incapacitated. Women in comas, suffering from catalepsy, or deemed mad were considered property rather than people. The king's violation of Talia's unconscious form wasn't seen as a crime by the standards of his time. It was seen as his right as a nobleman. Historical records from the period document similar cases. In 1387, court documents from Florence describe a nobleman who claimed an unconscious woman found after a plague outbreak. In 1445, Venetian records mention a merchant who kept a cataleptic woman in his household, treating her as his concubine, despite her inability to consent or even acknowledge his presence. Months passed in Basil's tale. Talia's body, guided by some dark magic, gave birth to twins, while she remained trapped in her cursed slumber. This horrifying detail reflected real medical beliefs of the time. Medieval physicians documented cases of posthumous birth, where women would deliver children hours or even days after apparent death. They called it coffin birth, and it was seen as either miraculous or demonic, depending on the circumstances. The idea that an unconscious woman could conceive and bear children wasn't fantasy to Bosel's audiences. It was a documented medical phenomenon they feared and whispered about. Midwives' journals from the 14th and 15th centuries contain accounts of women who remained in death-like states throughout pregnancy and labor, their bodies performing biological functions while their minds remained absent. One of the infants in the story, searching for milk, began sucking on Talia's finger instead, the same finger that had been pierced by the cursed spindle. The child's sucking drew out the splinter, and Talia finally awakened to find herself holding two babies she had never conceived in consciousness. This detail was lifted directly from medieval medical texts that described how certain toxins could be extracted through sustained suction. The awakening itself represented every woman's nightmare in an age when rape was common and legal recourse was non-existent. Talia awakened not to rescue, but to the realization that her body had been used and violated while her mind was absent. She faced motherhood without memory of conception, trapped in a situation she could neither escape nor legally challenge. The king eventually returned, delighted to find Talia awake and caring for their children. His casual assumption of ownership over both Talia and the children reflected medieval marriage laws that treated women as property to be transferred between men. But his wife had discovered the affair through methods that were all too real in royal court's networks of spies and informants who monitored their husbands' activities. In a rage born of betrayal, the queen ordered the cook to kill the children and serve them to her husband for dinner. This wasn't pure fantasy. It was based on documented cases of revenge, poisoning, and murder within royal households. The court of the Borgias was notorious for using poison and cannibalism as tools of vengeance. In 1503, Lucretia Borgia was rumored to have served her husband's lover's heart to him at a feast. Though historians debate the truth of this account, medieval chronicles contain numerous references to children being murdered and served as food during acts of revenge. The practice was so common that noble households employed food tasters specifically to detect human flesh mixed with animal meat. The horror wasn't in the fantastical nature of the act, but in its terrifying plausibility. The cook in tale, horrified by the command, hid the children and served lamb instead. This detail reflected the moral complexity faced by servants in noble households. Court records show that servants who refused orders to commit murder were often executed themselves, while those who complied might face eternal damnation according to church teachings. But the queen's thirst for revenge wasn't satisfied by the supposed death of the children. She built a massive fire and commanded her guards to throw Talia into the flames. Public burning was the standard execution method for women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or other crimes against moral order. The queen's choice of execution method would have been legally justified under medieval law. Talia had, technically, committed adultery by bearing another man's children, even though she was unconscious during the act. As Talia stood before the pyre, she slowly removed each piece of clothing, prolonging her life with each garment. This detail was based on actual execution protocols. Condemned women were allowed to remove valuable clothing and jewelry to pass to their families before death. The gradual undressing served both practical and psychological purposes, gave family members time to arrive with last-minute reprieves, and it forced the condemned to participate in their own execution. Historical accounts describe women spending hours at the stake, slowly removing layers of clothing, while crowds gathered and family members attempted last-minute legal interventions. The ritual became a form of torture in itself, with the condemned forced to actively participate in the process that would end their lives. The king arrived just in time to save Talia, and in his fury, he threw his wife into the very flames she had prepared for her victim. This reversal represented a common fantasy in folktales, that justice would ultimately prevail, and the powerful would face the same fates they imposed on others. But in reality, such reversals were rare. Kings typically faced no consequences for adultery, while their wives could be executed for far less. The story's ending with Talia marrying her rapist and living happily ever after, reflected the grim reality that many medieval women faced. Marriage to one's rapist was often the only option available, as rape victims were considered damaged goods unsuitable for other marriages. Many cultures had laws requiring rapists to marry their victims, ostensibly to provide them with financial support, but actually to resolve the property damage caused by the assault. This tale of sexual assault, attempted infanticide, and burning alive was considered appropriate entertainment for centuries. The Grimm brothers later sanitized it, removing the rape and focusing on the magic elements. But even their version retained disturbing elements, during which her body remained perfectly preserved. A detail that carries uncomfortable implications about the fantasy of the eternally available woman. The transformation from Basil's brutal tale to Disney's romantic fairy tale represents one of the most dramatic sanitizations in literary history. The original story wasn't about true love conquering all. It was about the vulnerability of women in a world where they had no legal protection and no recourse against powerful men who wished to exploit them. Modern audiences often wonder why fairy tales needed to be cleaned up for children. The answer lies in understanding what these stories originally were not entertainment, but warnings. They were meant to prepare young people, especially young women, for the brutal realities they would face in adult life. The magic elements weren't there to delight children, but to provide psychological distance from horrors that were all too real. The true horror of Sleeping Beauty isn't the cursets, how a story of rape and attempted murder became a bedtime tale we tell our children, whitewashed into a romance about true love conquering all. In sanitizing these stories, we've lost not only their original meaning, but also the historical context that created them. We've forgotten that fairy tales were never meant to be comforting lies, but rather uncomfortable truths wrapped in the protective veil of fantasy. The princess who sleeps for 100 years, waiting for her prince to awaken her, represents every woman who has been rendered powerless by circumstances beyond her control. Her story reminds us that in a world where women had no agency over their own bodies, even sleep could become a prison, and awakening could be worse than any curse. The key trembled in her hand as she approached the forbidden door. Behind it lay the truth about her new husband and the fate that awaited her. But this wasn't merely a tale of feminine curiosity meeting masculine authority. This was the story of Gilda Race, one of history's most prolific serial killers, whose reign of terror left hundreds of children dead across 15th century France. Charles Perrault's Bluebeard, published in 1697, wasn't born from imagination. It was a thinly veiled account of real horrors that had traumatized France 2.5 centuries earlier. When Perrault wrote about a wealthy nobleman with a taste for murdering wives, his French audiences would have immediately recognized the inspiration, a man whose name had become synonymous with evil throughout their country. Gilda Race began his career as a war hero, fighting alongside Joan of Arc against the English invaders. Born into vast wealth, he owned more than a dozen castles across Brittany and Poitou. His military prowess was legendary. He had participated in the Siege of Orleans and witnessed Joan's greatest triumphs. To outward appearances, he was everything a medieval nobleman should be: brave, wealthy, pious, and devoted to the defense of France. But beneath this noble facade lurked something monstrous that would make Bluebeard's fictional crimes seem almost merciful by comparison. The transformation began after Joan of Arc's capture and execution in 1431. Historical records suggest that witnessing her death broke something fundamental in de Retz' psyche. He withdrew from military service and retreated to his estates, where his behavior grew increasingly erratic. Servants reported strange smells emanating from locked rooms in his castles, the sounds of children crying at night, and the Baron's obsession with alchemical experiments designed to summon demons. But it was his method of acquiring victims that most closely paralleled the Bluebeard tale. Like the fictional nobleman who lured wives with promises of wealth and luxury, de Retz used his reputation and riches to gain the trust of families throughout the region. In 1435, families across Brittany and Poitou began reporting missing children. De Retz would send representatives to peasant villages, claiming he was seeking boys to serve as pages in his household. The offer was irresistible to impoverished families. Their sons would receive education, food, clothing, and the opportunity to advance in noble society. Parents competing for these positions would present their most beautiful and intelligent boys, believing they were providing them with opportunities for a better life. The parallel to Bluebeard's wives is chilling. Just as the fictional nobleman's reputation for wealth attracted desperate women seeking security, de Retz's reputation as a war hero and his promises of advancement attracted desperate families seeking escape from poverty. In both cases, the victims willingly entered the predator's domain. Drawn by promises that seemed too good to refuse, the children entered de Retz's castles and were never seen again. For years, the disappearances continued. Local authorities, intimidated by de Retz's wealth and political connections, turned blind eyes to mounting evidence. Parents who dared question their children's fate were dismissed or threatened. Church officials who should have investigated the spiritual implications of children vanishing from Christian households remained silent. The nobility protected one of their own, just as Bluebeard's status protected him from scrutiny until his final wife discovered his secret. Contemporary accounts describe the growing atmosphere of terror in the regions surrounding de Retz's castles. Parents became afraid to let their children play outside. Entire villages began locking their doors at nightfall. The mere mention of de Retz's name was enough to send families fleeing to other regions. Yet still the disappearances continued, because poverty made the Baron's offers impossible to refuse. The truth, when it finally emerged during de Retz's trial in 1440, was beyond imagination. He had tortured and murdered between 80 and 200 children, possibly more. The methods were unspeakably cruel. He would hang them from hooks in his private chambers, partially suffocate them, then revive them to prolong their agony. He performed occult rituals with their blood and internal organs, believing he could summon demons to restore his dwindling fortune. The trial records, preserved in the archives of Nantes, contain testimonies so disturbing that court scribes sometimes refused to record them. Witnesses described rooms in de Retz's castles where children's bodies were dismembered and burned, the ashes scattered in moats to hide the evidence. Servants testified about being forced to dispose of small bodies, often multiple victims, in a single night. The Baron's confessor, Father Eustache Blanquet, provided the most chilling testimony. He described how Derace would summon him after his killing sprees, seeking absolution for what he called his little recreations. The priest revealed that Derace showed no remorse for the murders themselves, only fear that his actions might prevent him from achieving his alchemical goals. Most disturbing was the revelation that Derace had kept detailed records of his victims. He maintained lists of their names, ages, and the specific tortures he had inflicted. Some entries described experiments he performed on living children, testing their reactions to various forms of pain. Others detailed his attempts to preserve body parts for occult rituals, treating human children like laboratory specimens. The parallel chambers in Perrault's Bluebeard tale where each wife discovered the corpses of her predecessors directly reflected the reality of Derace castles. Investigation of his properties revealed multiple rooms dedicated to torture and murder. Some contained implements of restraint sized for children. Others held altars surrounded by human bones and pools of dried blood. The most haunting discovery was Derace's private chapel, where investigators found children's skulls arranged around a crucifix. The Baron had convinced himself that his murders were religious acts, sacrifices that would earn him supernatural power. This perversion of Christian symbolism added a blasphemous dimension to his crimes that particularly horrified his contemporaries. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, Derace initially maintained his innocence, just as Bluebeard attempted to prevent his wife from entering the forbidden chamber. But unlike the fictional character, Derace eventually confessed, providing gruesome details about his methods and motivations. His confession filled over 100 pages of court records, a litany of horror that traumatized even hardened judges. The Baron's execution drew crowds from across France. He was simultaneously hanged and burned, a death reserved for the most heinous criminals. Contemporary accounts describe his final moments, when he allegedly showed remorse for his crimes and begged forgiveness from the families of his victims. Whether this repentance was genuine or performed remains a subject of historical debate. Perrault transformed this real-life nightmare into Bluebeard, a cautionary tale about feminine curiosity. But he missed the deeper horror of the original events. The true terror wasn't about a wife's disobedience, it was about unchecked power and the vulnerability of the innocent. Derace used his wealth and status as a shield, operating with impunity while families suffered in ignorance. The most chilling aspect of the Derace case wasn't the murders themselves, but how long they continued unchallenged for nearly a decade. A serial killer operated openly in medieval France, protected by class, privilege, and political connections. Parents delivered their children to him voluntarily, and authorities ignored mounting evidence, because investigating would have been socially and politically inconvenient. This aspect of the story, the complicity of society in enabling evil, was too dangerous for Perrault to address directly. By transforming the victims from innocent children to curious wives, he created a narrative that blamed the victims for their own fate while absolving the systems that protected their killer. When Bluebeard's wife discovers the chamber full of his previous wives' corpses, she's experiencing what those medieval parents never could: the truth about the monster they had trusted with their children's lives. Her horror isn't just about discovering death, but about realizing how many others had suffered the same fate. and how close she came to joining them. The fairy tale ends with rescue and justice. But for the real victims of Gillaudet race, there was no last-minute salvation, only silence and centuries of parents telling their children bedtime stories inspired by their suffering, never knowing the true source of the tale's power to terrify, the key that opens. Bluebeard's chamber isn't just a plot device, it's a symbol of the terrible knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Behind every sanitized fairy tale lies a door we've chosen not to open, and sometimes that choice protects us from truths too horrible to bear. The witch's oven was already hot when the children arrived at her gingerbread house. But the true horror of their story wasn't born from fantasy, it emerged from the starving villages of medieval Europe, where parents faced an unthinkable choice between watching all their children die slowly or sacrificing some to save the others. The brothers Grimm collected Hansel and Gretel from German folk tales that had circulated for centuries, but the story's roots dig deep into historical famines that drove desperate families to the brink of madness. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions across Europe, and it was during these years that the most disturbing elements of the fairy tale, Northern Europe, while volcanic eruptions in distant lands altered global climate patterns. Chroniclers of the time described it as God's punishment for humanity's sins, but the reality was far more mundane and infinitely more terrifying. Crops rotted in waterlogged fields. Livestock died from disease and starvation. Salt became so scarce that meat couldn't be preserved. Within months, entire regions faced complete societal collapse. In this context, the parents' decision to abandon their children wasn't born from evil. Stepmother cruelty, it was a calculated act of survival, practiced by thousands of desperate families across Europe. In the original versions collected by the Grimm brothers, the children weren't simply abandoned, they were deliberately led to their deaths. Parents, watching their families slowly starve, made an agonizing decision. Better to lose to children quickly than watch all of them die slowly from hunger. Also a burial ground where evidence of these desperate choices could be hidden. Contemporary chronicles from the famine. The Annals of Xanten describe parents in the Rhineland who sent their children into the woods to seek food, knowing they would not return. A French chronicle from 1317 records that mothers could no longer bear to watch their infants starve, and many took them to distant places where God might show mercy upon them. But abandonment was only the beginning of the horror. Historical records from the famine years contain accounts that mirror the. In 1321, a French chronicle recorded instances of parents killing and eating their own children. German records describe families luring neighbor children into their homes, butchering them, and selling the meat at market as pork. The transformation from human to food source was gradual and systematic. Church records from the period describe the progression of starvation in affected communities. First, families consumed their seed grain, ensuring future starvation. Then they ate their livestock, including breeding animals. Next came pets. Then leather goods boiled for whatever nutrition they might provide. When these sources were exhausted, the living began consuming the dead. Cemetery records from the period show evidence of grave robbing for food. Bodies were exhumed shortly after burial and systematically butchered. The church tried to prevent this by performing rapid burials and posting guards at graveyards. From the period, though often deliberately vague about details, document numerous cases of murder for food. Children were particularly vulnerable because they were small enough to overpower, and their disappearance might be attributed to natural causes or wild animals. The witch's gingerbread house in the fairy tale wasn't a fantastical creation. It represented the very real practice of using food as bait during famine periods. Starving adults would offer precious food to homeless children, fattening them up before slaughter. The witch was simply a woman driven to cannibalism by desperation, her appearance made monstrous by malnutrition and moral collapse. Contemporary accounts describe women who had resorted to cannibalism as becoming physically transformed by their actions. Chronic malnutrition caused their hair to thin and their skin to take on an unhealthy pallor. Their behavior became increasingly erratic as the psychological trauma of their actions, combined with the physical effects of starvation. To survive, they had to overcome every instinct of human decency, and the process left visible marks. The detail about the witch's house being made of gingerbread and candy reflected the reality that any display of food during famine would attract desperate children like moths to flame. Families that had managed to hoard small amounts of food could easily lure starving children to their homes. The magical appearance of the house represented how any source of food would seem miraculous to children who hadn't eaten properly in months. Archaeological evidence supports these horrors. Excavations of medieval sites from famine periods reveal human bones mixed with animal remains in cooking pits. Cut marks on children's skeletons match patterns found on butchered livestock. In some cases, the bones show evidence of being cracked open to extract marrow. The actions of people who had exhausted every other food source. One of the most disturbing archaeological discoveries was made in 1987 at a site in Bavaria. Researchers found the remains of what appeared to be a medieval kitchen, but the bone fragments told a horrifying story. The bones had been carefully cleaned and the marrow extracted, suggesting systematic processing rather than desperate one-time cannibalism. The oven where Hansel and Gretel pushed the witch wasn't just a plot device, it was the method by which human flesh was prepared for consumption during the worst famines. Village ovens, normally used for communal bread making, became crematoriums for evidence of unthinkable acts. The shared ovens also allowed communities to collectively participate in hide acts of cannibalism. Records from the period describe the horror of neighbors who discovered human flesh being cooked in communal ovens. In some cases, entire villages became complicit in cannibalistic practices, with community leaders organizing the systematic hunting and processing of vulnerable individuals. The social fabric that normally protected the weak completely collapsed under the pressure of starvation. Even more disturbing are the records of children who survived these encounters. Church documents from the post-famine period contain testimonies from children who described being kept in cages, pots while they waited their turn, saved only by the arrival of food supplies that ended the immediate crisis. These survivor accounts provided the psychological details that make the Hansel and Gretel story so compelling. The children's experience of being imprisoned and fattened, their witnessing of other victims' fates, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, precious food being wasted, as navigation aids would have been particularly meaningful to audiences familiar with famine. The foolishness of discarding edible bread would have immediately established the children's innocence and inexperience with true hunger. No child who had experienced real starvation would have wasted food in such a manner. The witch's blindness in the story reflected another reality of famine periods. Vitamin deficiencies caused by extended malnutrition often led to vision problems, and many who survived on diets of unusual foods suffered permanent eye damage. The witch's reliance on touch to determine whether Hansel was ready for slaughter wasn't magical, it was a realistic portrayal of someone suffering from starvation-induced blindness, about cleverness triumphing over evil. But the original listeners would have understood the deeper truth. In a world where starvation turned neighbors into predators and parents into executioners, even children had to become killers to survive. The moment when Hansel and Gretel hunted becoming the hunters. But this wasn't a triumph of good over evil, as modern audiences interpret it. Stories ending with the children returning home to find their parents repentant and welcoming reflected not reality, but wish fulfillment. In actual famine situations, children who managed to survive on their own rarely found their families alive or willing to take them back. The resources that led parents to abandon children in the first place usually hadn't improved, and additional mouths to feed remained unwelcome. When we tell our children about Hansel and Gretel's victory over the witch, we're celebrating the moment when the hunted became hunters, when innocence died in the flames of necessity. The true horror isn't that children might encounter cannibalistic witches in the forest, but that circumstances might arise where children would need to become killers to survive, and where parents would be forced to choose which of their children deserved to live. Little Red Riding Hood skipped through the forest, unaware that the wolf stalking her wasn't the only predator lurking in the woods. The real danger came from those she trusted most, and the true horror of her tale lay not in encountering monsters, but in discovering that monsters could appear as protectors, family members, and pillars of the community. The earliest known version of this tale, recorded in 11th century European folklore, wasn't about a wolf at all. It was about men who used the cover of wilderness to prey upon children and communities that failed to protect the most vulnerable among them. The story emerged from a medieval world where children faced constant threats, not from fantastical beasts, but from the humans around them. In medieval France, the story was known as the false grandmother, and it contained elements so disturbing that later collectors sanitized them beyond recognition. The original tale began not with a little girl in a red hood, but with a child whose parents deliberately sent her into danger not from ignorance, but from necessity. Medieval French society was built on a feudal system where children, particularly female children, were economic burdens until they could be married off or put to work. Parents often made calculated decisions about which children were worth feeding and protecting. Sending a child on a dangerous journey through the forest wasn't always about helping an elderly relative. Sometimes it was about reducing the number of mouths to feed at home. Historical records from the period reveal why such stories emerged. Wolves were indeed a threat in medieval Europe. Gévaudan beast killed over 100 people in 18th century France, but they weren't the primary danger facing unaccompanied children. Court documents from the 12th and 13th centuries reveal that Bandits, deserters from armies, and men cast out from society for violent crimes lived as outcasts in the forests. These human wolves were far more dangerous than their four-legged counterparts. The French Inquisition records contain numerous accounts of men who preyed on children traveling alone through forest paths. Unlike animal predators that killed for food, these human predators often kept their victims alive for extended periods, using remote forest locations as bases for systematic abuse. Some operated alone, while others formed groups that would capture, trade, and abuse children like livestock. The grandmother's house in the deep woods wasn't an innocent cottage, it was a trap. Court records from the 12th and 13th centuries document numerous cases of men who posed as isolated elderly women, luring children to remote locations. Some were escaped criminals seeking to avoid capture. Others were individuals whose mental conditions or violent tendencies had made them dangerous to live in normal society. The deception was often elaborate and long planned. These predators would establish fake identities in remote areas, sometimes spending months or even years building reputations as harmless elderly women living alone. They would befriend families in nearby villages, learning about children who might be sent on errands or visits. When opportunities arose, they would request specific children be sent to help with various tasks. Knowing the children would arrive alone and defenseless, archaeological evidence from medieval forest settlements supports these dark interpretations. Excavations have revealed isolated dwellings that appear to have been designed for confinement rather than normal habitation. Some contain evidence of restraints built into walls, while others show signs of modifications designed to prevent escape. Most disturbing are the remains of multiple individuals found at these sites, often children whose bones show evidence of prolonged captivity and systematic abuse. In the unexpurgated version of the tale, the wolf doesn't simply eat the grandmother and take her place. He forces the child to participate in consuming her grandmother's flesh and blood, convincing her it's wine and cake. This horrifying detail reflected real cases documented in medieval court records where children were forced to participate in cannibalistic acts, psychologically breaking them before they became victims themselves. The forced consumption of human flesh served multiple purposes for medieval predators. It created psychological trauma that made victims less likely to escape or report their experiences. It also implicated children in acts they had been taught were mortal sins, convincing them they were now beyond redemption and had no choice but to remain with their captors. Church doctrine taught that consuming human flesh damned the soul, and many children believed they could never return to normal Christian society after being forced into cannibalism. Contemporary accounts from church confessors describe children who had escaped from forest predators but were unable to reintegrate into society because they believed themselves damned by their experiences. Some spent years in monasteries trying to atone for sins they had been forced to commit. Others became hermits themselves, unable to face their families or communities. The story's sexual undertones, largely removed from modern versions, were explicit in the original. The wolf's request for the girl to undress and join him in bed wasn't subtle metaphor, it was a direct representation of child sexual abuse. Medieval audiences understood that eaten by the wolf often meant something far worse than death. court records from the period contain euphemistic references to children being devoured by predators, using the same language that appeared in folktales. This wasn't coincidental. Legal documents and folk stories shared a common vocabulary for describing sexual violence against children, because both were attempting to discuss acts too horrific for direct description. The systematic nature of these crimes is revealed in medieval legal documents that describe networks of predators operating across regions. Some court cases reveal that children were traded between different wolves, passed from one forest dwelling to another like commodities. Others describe predators who specialized in different types of victims, some targeting boys, others girls, some preferring very young children, while others sought adolescents. Perhaps most disturbing is the role of the parents in the original tale. They weren't ignorant of the danger, they were complicit in it. Some versions explicitly state that the parents needed to be rid of the child, either due to poverty or because she had witnessed something she shouldn't have. The forest became a convenient disposal method for inconvenient children. Medieval legal records contain numerous cases where parents sold children to known predators, receiving payment in exchange for their silence about the child's fate. Some parents even provided their children with specific instructions designed to make them more appealing to predators, teaching them to be obedient, trusting, and compliant with adult authority. The complicity of communities was equally disturbing. Village records show that many settlements knew about predators operating in nearby forests, but did nothing to warn travelers or protect children. Some communities even developed informal arrangements with forest-dwelling criminals, allowing them to prey on outsiders in exchange for leaving local children alone. Archaeological evidence from medieval villages supports these allegations of complicity. Some settlements show evidence of defensive preparations that could only have been effective against human threats, not animal ones. Others contain mass graves of children who were clearly not local residents, suggesting they may have served as dumping grounds for the victims of forest predators. The red hood itself, in the earliest versions, wasn't a cheerful red cape, but a symbol of menstruation, marking the child as sexually mature and therefore a target. Medieval beliefs held that wolves, both animal and human, were attracted to the scent of blood, making menstruating girls particularly vulnerable to attack. This detail reveals another layer of the story's horror. Parents who sent their daughters into the forest wearing red hoods weren't just ignorant of the danger. They were advertising their children's sexual availability to predators. The hood served as a signal that the child had reached physical maturity and was therefore ready for sexual abuse. The transformation from innocent child to sexual target was a recognized phenomenon in medieval society. Girls who began menstruating faced immediate changes in how they were treated by adult men, and parents were expected to take precautions to protect their daughter's virtue. Sending a girl through the forest in a red hood was equivalent to painting a target on her back. When Charles Perrault wrote his version in 1697, he added a moral: young girls should not trust strangers, especially charming ones. But he missed the deeper horror of the original tale. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers in the forest. It comes from the people who send you there. The true terror of Little Red Riding Hood isn't that wolves exist in the forest, but that the people who should protect children from wolves sometimes feed them to the beasts instead. The story's power comes not from the fear of encountering monsters, but from the recognition that monsters often come disguised as protectors, and that sometimes the path through the dark forest is one we're forced to walk not by accident, but by design. In sanitizing this tale for modern children, we've lost its essential warning that predators rely not just on isolated victims, but on communities willing to look the other way, and families desperate enough to sacrifice their children's safety for their own survival. The wolf in the forest is terrifying, but the wolves who dress as grandmothers and send children into the woods are infinitely more dangerous because they're the ones we trust. The glass slipper was filled with blood, as Cinderella's stepsisters desperately tried to fit their feet into the delicate shoe. They mutilated themselves beyond recognition, slicing off toes and heels in their desperation to claim the prince's hand. The crimson stains, seeping through the crystal, told a story of desperation, violence, and the brutal lengths to which families would go to escape poverty. This isn't Disney's sanitized version of romance and magic. This is the Brothers Grimm's, a tale soaked in violence and revenge that reflected the brutal realities of medieval European society, where marriage was warfare and love was a luxury few could afford. But even the Grimm version paled in comparison to the historical events that inspired it. The story of Cinderella emerged from a tradition of arranged marriages where young women were literally sold to the highest bidder, and the competition between families could turn deadly. In a world where a woman's value was measured entirely by her marriage prospects, desperation drove families to commit acts of violence that would shock modern audiences. That in medieval Europe, marriage wasn't about love, it was about property transfer and political alliance. Young women were commodities, their value determined by dowries, bloodlines, and their ability to produce male heirs. Families would go to extraordinary lengths to secure advantageous marriages for their daughters, even if it meant destroying other girls in the process. The historical record is filled with accounts of families using poison, manipulation, and outright murder to eliminate competition for wealthy suitors. In 1477, court documents from Florence describe a case where 3 sisters from different families all sought to marry the same wealthy merchant. By the end of the year, 2 of them were dead, one from mysterious poisoning that caused her hair to fall out and her skin to turn black, another from a fall down a flight of stairs that left her skull crushed and her body twisted. The Venetian archives contain even more disturbing records from 1503, describing a competition between 5 families to marry their daughters to a wealthy spice trader. The competition began with subtle sabotaged, dresses torn at crucial moments. False rumors spread about girls' virtue, dowries mysteriously stolen. A third disappeared entirely, though witnesses reported seeing her forced into a boat by masked men. The stepmother's cruelty in Cinderella wasn't exaggerated, was typical. Stepmothers in medieval society often had to choose between their own children's survival and their stepchildren's welfare. Resources were limited, and sentiment was a luxury most couldn't afford. Historical records document cases of stepmothers selling stepchildren into servitude, arranging accidents to eliminate competition for inheritance. Cases where stepmothers were formally accused of murdering their stepchildren. In 1389, Court records from England describe a stepmother who gradually poisoned her stepdaughter over several months, feeding her small amounts of lead mixed with her food. The truth, the stepmother's defense was that she was protecting her own daughter's inheritance, justification the court found legally reasonable. Though morally questionable, the self-mutilation seen in the Grimm version where the stepsisters cut off parts of their feet to fit into the glass slipper was based on real practices documented throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The pursuit of marriage required physical perfection, and families would go to extreme lengths to achieve it, even if it meant permanent disfigurement. Chinese footbinding was well known to European traders by the 18th century, but Europe had its own traditions of bodily modification in pursuit of marriage. Corsets so tight they caused internal damage and permanent deformation of the ribcage were common among wealthy families. Lead-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned users but created fashionably pale skin were used routinely to alter facial features, remove birthmarks, or change body shape were performed by barber surgeons who doubled as beauticins. Archaeological evidence reveals the extent of these practices. Medieval graveyards contain skeletons showing evidence of deliberate bone deformation consistent with extreme corseting. Some show signs of surgical modification, broken and reset noses, jawbones altered to create more fashionable facial structures. Even evidence of primitive breast enhancement procedures using foreign materials inserted under the skin. The glass slipper itself may have been inspired by a real historical artifact discovered in 1748 by archaeologists excavating a medieval gravesite in Bavaria. The burial contained a collection of impossibly small shoes crafted from crystal and precious metals. The shoes showed evidence of having been worn by feet that had been surgically altered, bones fused together, toes amputated, heels reshaped through repeated breaking and setting. The skeletal remains in the grave told a horrifying story. The woman had endured years of agony to maintain the tiny foot size that was fashionable among nobility. Her leg bones showed evidence of chronic infection from the surgical modifications. Her spine was curved from years of walking on artificially altered feet. Most disturbing, the grave contained the preserved remains of the amputated toes and heel bones, carefully wrapped in silk and buried with their former owner. Medical texts from the period describe the procedures used to create these fashionable deformities. Physicians would gradually break and reset foot bones, binding them in unnatural positions to create the desired shape. The process took months or years and required constant maintenance. Many women died from infections caused by these procedures, while others spent their lives as invalids, unable to walk without assistance. But the most disturbing element of the Cinderella story isn't the abuse, it's the revenge. In the original Grimm version, birds peck out the stepsisters' eyes as punishment for their deception. This wasn't fantasy. It was justice, as medieval audiences understood it. Court records from the period describe public punishments where convicted criminals had body parts removed or destroyed as both punishment and warning to others. Medieval justice operated on the principle of proportional revenge. Those who deceived others about their identity would have their faces marked or destroyed. Women who used false beauty to attract husbands would have that beauty permanently removed. The specific punishment of having eyes pecked out by birds was reserved for women who had used deception in marriage negotiations, symbolically removing their ability to see future opportunities for similar crimes. Contemporary accounts describe public punishment ceremonies where trained birds were used to remove the eyes of condemned criminals. Ravens and crows, known for their intelligence and ability to target specific body parts, were particularly favored for these executions. Deterrent effect on witnesses. The transformation scene, where Cinderella magically becomes beautiful for the ball, reflected the real practice of wealthy families temporarily lending jewelry, clothing, and even servants to less fortunate relatives when advantageous marriages were at stake. These arrangements were carefully documented in family contracts, specifying exactly what items were being borrowed and for how long. Medieval account books contain detailed records of these temporary transformations. Families would lend everything from jewelry and dresses to cosmetics and wigs, sometimes even hiring professional beauticians to transform a peasant girl into a convincing noblewoman for a single evening. The midnight deadline represented the harsh reality that such pretenses couldn't be maintained. Indefinitely borrowed items had to be returned, hired servants had to go home, and the temporary transformation would inevitably fade. The most extensive documented case occurred in 1456, when a minor Italian noble family spent their entire fortune transforming their daughter for a single night at the Medici court. They borrowed clothing worth more than their annual income, hired a team of artists to apply cosmetics and style her hair, and even paid actors to pretend to be her servants. The transformation was so successful that she attracted the attention of a wealthy banker's son. But when her true circumstances were discovered, the backlash destroyed both families. The fairy godmother figure represented the professional marriage brokers who operated throughout medieval Europe. These women, often widows with connections to multiple social classes, specialized in arranging advantageous marriages for families who couldn't navigate the complex social hierarchies themselves. They knew which families were seeking wives, what qualities they valued, and how to present girls in the most favorable light. Marriage brokers maintained detailed records of available young women, noting their physical attributes, family backgrounds, and any deformities or scandals that might affect their value. They also kept catalogs of potential husbands, including information about their wealth, temperament, and preferences in wives. The most successful brokers could transform a peasant girl into a merchant's wife or elevate a merchant's daughter into minor nobility. But these transformations came at a price. Marriage brokers demanded substantial payments for their services, often requiring families to mortgage their property or sell themselves into debt. Some demanded sexual favors from the girls they were promoting, threatening to sabotage marriage negotiations if they were refused. Others operated elaborate fraud schemes, taking payments from multiple families while promising the same marriage opportunities. The dance at the royal ball represented the marriage markets that occurred at major festivals and religious celebrations. These events brought together families from across regions, providing opportunities for marriage negotiations that would have been impossible through normal social channels. Young women would display themselves like merchandise, competing for the attention of the wealthiest men present. Contemporary accounts describe these events as combining the atmosphere of a livestock market with the desperation of an auction. Housegirls would be lined up for inspection, with their families highlighting their positive attributes while attempting to conceal any flaws. Physical examinations where common potential husbands would inspect girls' teeth, hands, and posture like they were buying horses. The competition could be vicious. Families would attempt to sabotage rivals through gossip, bribery, or direct interference. Some hired professionals to spread rumors about competitors' virtue or family history. Others would deliberately damage rivals' clothing or appearance at crucial moments. The most desperate would resort to poison, ensuring their competition became too ill to participate effectively. The prince's search for Cinderella through the glass slipper represented the medieval practice of using physical evidence to verify marriage contracts. In an age before photography or standardized identification, physical characteristics were often the only way to confirm identity. Unusual features like exceptionally small feet, distinctive scars, or rare birthmarks became legally significant markers. Medieval marriage contracts often included detailed physical descriptions of both parties, specifying height, weight, eye color, and any distinguishing marks. These descriptions served as legal protection against substitution fraud, where families might attempt to substitute one daughter for another after negotiations were complete. The more distinctive the physical characteristic, the more legally binding it became. The blood in the glass slipper, the detail that reveals the stepsister's deception, represented the ultimate medieval metaphor for the price of social mobility. The image of blood seeping through crystal perfectly captured the reality that advancement in medieval society required sacrifice, often involving permanent damage to those who pursued it. When we tell children the story of Cinderella today, we present it as a tale about inner beauty triumphing over adversity. But the original audiences understood it as something darker, story about the lengths desperate people will go to escape poverty and the terrible price of social mobility in a world where human worth was measured in gold and bloodlines. The true horror of Cinderella isn't that she was abused by her stepfamily. It's that her story was so common, so unremarkable, that it became a template for children's entertainment, a reminder that in a world built on inequality, sometimes the only escape from victimhood is to become the victimizer. The glass slipper filled with blood represents every dream that requires others to bleed for its fulfillment. Every success built on another's suffering. The birds that peck out the stepsisters' eyes aren't agents of divine justice, they're symbols of a world where survival requires the willingness to destroy others, where mercy is a luxury that only the secure can afford. In Cinderella's world, as in our own, there are no true victims or villains, only those who win and those who lose, and the terrible things people do to avoid being on the wrong side of that equation.